shop on Charing Cross Road. And even though we never saw a picture of each other before, if I remember correctly, there was instant recognition at the door of the bookstore. And then we went off, of course, chuckling away down Charing Cross Road to a wonderful pub, and we had a great lunch together. And that began my personal association with Brian Morris. Now, I knew Bookchin for at least 37 or 38 years, from the late 1960s. And I thought that I understood and knew a great deal of what he wrote and what he articulated over all of that period of time. But I have to tell you one thing, a confession, that when I read this extraordinary book by Brian Morris, and I read the section that he wrote on Murray Bookchin, I learned new things for the first time. Apart from the fact that it is written in the most lucid English, and anybody who wants to learn how to write English and how to speak English, to read this book just for the joy of reading excellent English. The section on Bookchin is absolutely a jewel. I cannot recommend it highly enough. So when I got a copy at the Oslo conference, a hard copy, I decided to contact Brian and to invite him to collaborate with Black Rose Books to come out with a paperback edition, because unfortunately it was a book that had absolutely no circulation in North America as far as we knew in Montreal. So it's highly recommended for you not to leave this conference or this event without a copy of this book. We're also going to present it again in tonight at the book launch. Is a person who had a very interesting personal history, like Murray Bookchin, like a lot of extraordinary people. And once you press a button, he will take you through fields and forests and mountains and all sorts of places that are out of normal reach. So that's the sort of general context I want to get him in the right mood. I'm sure he is. This is very, very because you're going to learn some new insights about the work of Murray Bookchin and his legacy. Thank you, Brian, for coming to Thessaloniki, and thank you for coming and giving us your talk.
Trying to avoid the media. I'm not, and I don't think I'm going to be able to do it today. I mean, it's like, yeah. Well, thank you for that. It's really nice. Just a little bit about myself to start, I suppose. I'm a complete failure as an academic. I failed my 11 plus. That was the first thing that happened. I failed my 11 plus. So the education decided I really wasn't an intellectual. I left school at 15 and went to work in the foundry. I went to work in the foundry because my dad worked in the foundry, my granddad worked in the foundry, and all my uncles worked in the foundry. You know, so I went. I come from the black country, working class. So, and then when I was 15, I smashed up my hand. So I wasn't very good as a foundry worker either. You know, so I smashed up my hand. But that was one of the best things that happened in my life because I got 120 quid in workman's compensation, and you won't believe. When I was a lad at 15, £120 was sort of gold, you know, it was a great deal of money. So when I was 20, I left home, I went to Africa. I spent 7 years in Africa, in Malawi. I have a great time in Malawi. And so I was there. And at the age of 29, I took my O-levels. And I did hope to get into university. I did want to get into university, you know, studied biology, but they refused me because I didn't have any A-levels, you know. So I trained as a teacher. I did teacher training. It was only later that I became an anthropologist. So I have that kind of background. So in many ways, I'm very similar. In other words, I don't pretend to, be in the same league as old Murray Bookchin, but I have a similar background, actually. I'm working class. I worked in a foundry. I didn't make it to university as an undergraduate. Okay, I'm basic and autodidact, you know. I don't like academics. And I never see myself as an academic. A lot of my friends tell to me, they actually say, look, Brian, you're not a real anthropologist, Brian. One of my friends talked about me as being an intellectual nomad. And he meant that as an insult, you know. But I am an intellectual nomad, and I like Bookchin again. I'm not only autodidact, but I'm a kind of interdisciplinary. You know, I wander from discipline to discipline. I don't see, although I do look upon myself as an anthropologist in a way, because anthropologist, as the Greek says, it's a study of people. Anyway, enough about myself. I've been asked to talk about the legacy of Murray Bookchin. And there's 3 reasons why I like talking about Murray Bookchin. The first thing is Dimitri asked me to talk about Murray Bookchin. And as you know, Dimitri's done an awful, there was this another world is possible a few years ago. There was that adage, another world is possible. What's great about Dimitri, he's always tried through his work and through his publishing, through Black Rose, given us an awareness. There is another world that is available beyond capitalism, So that's the first reason. The second reason is I think that Bookchin's often been forgotten. Let's make my time because I don't want to go on. I'll go on forever, The other thing, Bookchin's been forgotten. Basically, been forgotten. There's a book just come out. It's a really good book, and it's called The Age of Ecology by a German scholar called Joachim. I probably got the pronunciation wrong. Joachim Radko. It's called, it's called the Age of Ecology. So it's a big fat book, all on the history of the ecology movement. You won't kid yourself. There's no mention of Mumford and there's no mention of Murray Bookchin. And I was reading a book the other day, and I'm going to give you a quote from it. And it's quite a good book. It's by a Marxist, and it's called Facing the Anthropocene, by a Scottish bloke called Ian Angus. And this is what he said. We've got to kind of face the fact, the challenge that everyone who cares about humanity's future to face up to the fact that the survival in the Anthropocene requires radical social change, replacing fossil capitalism with an ecological civilization, eco-socialism, He doesn't mention the fact that Murray Bookchin was arguing this 40 or 50 years ago, How do you mention Murray Bookchin? Yeah. And the third thing why Murray Bookchin tends to be forgotten, I got invited to a conference at Oslo, and it was quite interesting. A lot of people there, and the conference was called Ecological Challenges. And what was interesting, a lot of people there had never heard of Murray Bookchin. The third reason I want to talk about Murray Bookchin, because when I read Post-Scarcity Anarchism in the early 1970s, I became a fan of Murray Bookchin. I'm a fan of Murray Bookchin. I'm a fan of Darwin. I'm a fan of Ernest Thompson Seton. I'm a fan of Kropotkin. I'm a fan of Mumford. I'm also a fan of Murray Bookchin. I don't consider myself his disciple. In fact, my attitude to Murray Bookchin is a bit like Murray Bookchin's attitude to Hegel. He was a fan of Hegel, but he hated being called Hegelian. He hated being called a new Hegelian. Murray Bookchin was Murray Bookchin. Brian Morris is Brian Morris. That's what I want to talk about, Murray Bookchin. Now, just a preliminary thing about Murray Bookchin. I think Murray Bookchin was one of the most provocative, the most creative, and the most important philosophers of the 20th century. And I say philosophers and not just a political philosopher. He was more than just a philosopher. He was a kind of ethical philosopher. He was a social philosopher. He was a natural philosopher. He was a philosopher in the widest sense. And so I think he was one of the most important and creative philosophers of the 20th century. And I say that, and I think history will prove it right as well. I think he's been, for 50 years he produced essays, political tracts, diatribes against people, and he also produced many substantial studies, you know, of the Spanish anarchists, the ecology movement, libertarian movements, the culture of the city, social ecology. One forgets, because he was a very polemic, he defended himself against others, you know. He was a very polemical writer, you know. He had his polemics against Marxism, he had his polemics against ecology, you know, he had a real against all the anarchists, you know, which are particularly the anarchists. Well, there's a question whether they are anarchists, but what he called the lifestyle anarchists, he had his kind of polemics against all the social biologists, or he defended himself. But Bookchin is more than a polemicist, you know. A lot of his substantial books actually are free of polemics, really, and they really are important books. So I don't think you should judge Bookchin on his polemical. And he was a very polemical writer. That's the thing. Now, in half an hour, I can hardly give you an outline of Bookchin. It's possible. For me, Bookchin is a very kind of, I forget what the word is now, a holistic thinker, everything, you know. He hated eclecticism. Don't forget, he was in the tradition of people like Aristotle and Spinoza and Hegel. He was he liked to bring things together and integrate things. You know, he hated this idea of fragmentation or eclecticism. And so there is a kind of way in which all of Bookchin's ideas are integrated. And the four ideas I'll just talk about, four kind of things. First of all, there's the modern crisis. There's the modern crisis. And then there's his response to the modern crisis, okay? Responding to the modern crisis, he develops social ecology and a philosophy. And then he develops that into a kind of a larger framework, which he calls dialectical naturalism and ethics. So out of the response comes a philosophy, out of the response comes an ethic, and then, of course, he develops another way of organizing social life, which is politics. And so it all kinds of hangs together in a way. There's a kind of consistency about Bookchin's thought, a kind of integration. And what I'll just do, I'll go 5 minutes, 5 minutes on the modern crisis, 5 minutes on social ecology, 5 minutes on dialectical naturalism, and 5 minutes on anarchism, okay? Starting off. It was interesting yesterday, a lot of people spoke really well about the modern crisis, Don't forget, for Bookchin, he was well known as a pioneer ecological thinker. And, you know, his early books, you know, on the syncretic environment, and he wrote a book called The Modern Crisis, a collection of essays called The Modern Crisis. It wasn't just an ecological crisis. For him, the crisis was a modern crisis. It was a modern crisis. And that crisis was social, it was economic, it was political, and it was ecological. Moreover, it was also global. Always been an ecological crisis in human history. You know, people have dug up the forest and done this and whatnot, and they suffered from it. There had always been crises global, but all the crises before were local. They were local phenomena. What was important about the modern crisis is that it was global. And also it was unprecedented. It was a crisis that humans had never known before. And the earth had never known before. Because what had happened, according, he more or less dated it to about 1950. Since 1950, with the spread in 1950 and the emergence of global capitalism, the world had changed, basically. Not only the situation of humans had changed, the world had changed. And it's interesting, when I first read, when I started, I was deeply into ecology in the 1960s, and in that period, there were two people that were important. Rachel Carson had written this book, the famous book, as it were, but the two, yeah. Rachel Carson, you know, Where Birds Know, whatever she called it. But the two people for me that were really important one was a Marxist called Barry Commoner, but really the important one was Bookchin. Bookchin was saying there was an ecological crisis. Okay? But more than that, there was a social crisis. Okay? And he talked about, he talked about what we had with capitalism. When is capitalism? I mean, capitalism has been around a long time, you know, since the sort of 17th century, 18th century. What had happened with capitalism since the Second World War? Capitalism had gone into every aspect of life. Part of our lives, the market economy had gone. So there was a social crisis. There was a crisis in the economy, and people were talking about yesterday about the global inequalities. You know, we're sort of 400 people are the richest people in the world have enough kind of wealth, and sort of half the human population. You know, so there was that crisis as well. There was a political crisis, and what particularly worried him, it was a proliferation of nuclear weapons and that, which really scared him. It really scared him with the nuclear, particularly the way that in his day, the Russians and the Americans in the Cold War were things, you know, and he was aware that if there was actually a nuclear war, it not only would devastate a lot of human beings, but it'd actually completely alter the planet, you know. And then there was the ecological crisis, and he outlined this quite well way back in 1962, but before Rachel Carson, of all the different things, and it was against things like, he stressed the industrial agriculture and how awful industrial agriculture was, because it was simplifying the world. It was covering the landscape with poison through the way of pesticides. It was reducing all the wildlife population, and it was awful what was going on. Changing the social structure. Okay, it was talking about deforestation. Deforestation wasn't poor peasants sort of having to go into the jungle, as it were. You know, it was all about big timber companies and big multinationals opening up the landscape, cutting down the trees, as it were. You know, sometimes it was for ranches to produce sort of, maize and soya for cattle, or it may be for sort of biofuels and things like that. Okay, so the deforestation, and he talked about the decline of wildlife. So there was this real ecological side. So that's the first thing you've got to realize about Bookchin. Bookchin is aware that what's going on in the world is the world's in a sorry state, and it's really serious. It's really global, and it's really unprecedented. But what was interesting about him, the most serious ecological thing that he started to worry about, and this is in the 1960s, the 1970s, this is a long time ago, he realized from his reading in biology, he realized that what was happening with fossil fuels, with the emissions of CO2, there was a blanket of CO2 appearing on the atmosphere. You know? So you were getting all this pollution for him. For him, there was pollution of the waters, there's pollution of the, pollution of the rivers, pollution of the oceans, and there was pollution of the atmosphere. And with this blanket of CO2, it was going to have detrimental effects to human beings and on the planet. It was really going to lead to rising waters. It was going to warm the planet up. The planet was going to get warmed up. There'd be more storms. There'd be more rainfall. You know. Don't forget, some people talk about with global warming, everything's going to get drier. You know, and there's desert. It's not like that at all. When the Earth warms up, it gets more moist. You know, there's more water because there's more evaporation from the seas. So there's all these what's happening in America at the moment. With this violent storm. So that's the first thing I've got to watch, because I'll go on and on. Oh, Jesus. I'll play about half an hour on the first one. Right, so that's it. There's a crisis. Right, how to respond to it. Okay. Social ecology. No. I often do this because it's an interesting thing. In the Vatican, there's a painting by Raphael, and it's called The School of Athens. You know? And on it, it shows you an old chap, grey-haired, a bit like me, okay, walking along, pointing up in the sky, okay? And next to him, there's another chap who looks like you, much darker, like that, and he's pointing down to the ground, okay? And what it depicts is Plato and Aristotle, okay? Plato, I don't know if you know, but Plato was a kind of shaman. Plato was a very religious thinker. I mean, he loved mathematics, but actually he was a real kind of religious thinker, Plato. Okay, he hated sort of the body or anything to do with the empirical world. He had a very dualistic conception, very religious thinker. Aristotle was completely the opposite. Aristotle was a very earthly character. He spent 2 years on Lesbos. In fact, I went to Lesbos just to go where Aristotle went. He spent a couple of years on Lesbos. He was a very, very good biologist, and his way of thinking is biological, which is what Bookchin recognized. He had an organic way of thinking. Okay, and Aristotle referred to himself as physikos. I probably got the wrong pronunciation. Physikos in Greek means the study of nature. Somebody who studies nature is a physikos. So they're very contrasting things, Plato and Aristotle. What is interesting when you look at Western philosophy, this is what they say. This is what they say. In Western philosophy, people either side with Plato or they either side with Aristotle. Guess which side old Bookchin went? Huh?
Aristotle.
Bookchin sided with Aristotle, And there's another famous quote in philosophy, and it's the fact is that by I.M. Whitehead, the history of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. Okay? Series of footnotes to Plato. Okay? And fair enough. If you have a look at Western philosophy, the lot of them, Aquinas, Leibniz, Descartes, Locke, Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, Wittgenstein, Husserl, the whole lot, they're all religious thinkers. The whole lot of them. They're all religious thinkers. And they're all pro-state as well. Now, what you've got to realize is that Bookchin sides with Aristotle, and he belongs to a minority tradition, which is often referred to as, he's not part of the Western kind of intellectual tradition, Bookchin. He's part of Aristotle's tradition, and he's part of a minority of tradition. Now, they used to be called materialists, actually, but Bookchin never likes the word materialist because it's so associated with the Marxist tradition that he always refers to himself as a naturalist. Okay, he always refers to himself as a naturalist, like that. The second thing that's interesting about that picture, what it depicts is a kind of paradox in human life. And a lot of people, not only Bookchin, but a lot of people have spoken about this paradox. People like Mumford, people like Eric Fromm, people like that. That basically, there's a tension in human life, really. Because on the one hand, humans are intrinsically linked to the natural world. They're natural beings. I mean, you are all breathing oxygen, I hope, okay? And you're all breathing out carbon dioxide, okay? And you're changing the world around you. We're intrinsically a part of nature. We're all eating this morning, I presume, because if you don't eat, you'll die. We're all intrinsically part of the natural world. But the other thing about humans is, and this is what Bookchin stresses also, the other thing about human beings, as it were, is that they develop technology, technology is so great now. They've developed technology, they've developed language, they've developed symbolic thought, they've developed very high levels of sociality, and that they've really developed a lot, humans. And humans, in a sense, are unique. And Bookchin embraces that paradox. He embraces the fact that human beings are both natural beings and they're social beings. And this is where the social ecology comes in. And I'll give you a quote from, and this is from, human beings are of, and Bookchin underlines it, of, okay? Human beings are of the biotic world, okay? As organisms, as mammals, and as primates. Yet they are also a part, and he underlines that as well, okay? From it as creatures that produce that vast array of cultural artifacts and social associations that we call second nature, So Bookchin embraces that paradox. Now, what he's interested in, to develop the philosophy, what the hell do we mean by nature? What is nature? And he recognized, in history, there's 57 varieties of nature, that people have talked about, nature's this, nature that, But what's good about Bookchin, he's very precise when he's talking about nature, what he means by nature. He's against, well, let me put it this way. A few years ago, I gave a talk to some Malawians in the Wildlife Society, okay? And what I did, I said, well, there are basically 3 ways in which humans have images of nature. And I called my article Conceptions of Nature when I got it published years later. But when I gave this talk, I said, there's a religious conception of nature. You know, whether you see it as animism, pantheism, or whatever. There's a religious conception of nature. There's a mechanistic conception of nature, which you've got with Descartes. They're a kind of mechanistic nature. And there's a way of looking at nature as an evolutionary process. Okay. Now, Bookchin takes up that very directly. One is against the idea of nature as a spiritual cosmos, something created by some divine spirit, or it's a kind of equating nature with some kind of spirit, like the deep ecologists. He's against that idea. He's against the mechanistic idea that Conf is very strongly anti-Descartes, anti-dualism, anti-mechanism. Okay, and he's anti this idea of the domination of nature. He's violently against it, this idea that we can dominate nature. He doubts whether we can in fact dominate nature. All we can do is ruin the world, as it were. So we never, you know, and he's a realist. He always argues that the natural world is, you know, it's an objective reality. It's an object, you know, when volcanoes erupt, they erupt, you know. They don't ask human beings, you know. So he stresses against the mechanistic things. And what he argues, what we really need is a way of thinking which is organic. In other words, he says, well, there's a way of thinking that's mystical, and he often uses that word mystical to apply to religion. There's a way of thinking that's mystical, there's a way of thinking that's mechanistic, and there's a really good way of thinking for him. Okay, the good way of thinking is actually a way of thinking which is dialectical, which is organic, and which looks, so the one way of looking at nature is a kind of religious way. The other way of looking at nature is as if it's a lifeless machine. You know, the one is a divine cosmos. The other is a sort of lifeless machine. Nature, for Bookchin, it's an evolutionary process. And what's important about that, and so he's a very organic thinker like Aristotle. And what's important to that, he said you've got to recognize that all life forms, all living beings, in a sense, they're not only alive, but they have, even bacteria has a sense of agency. It has a sense of subjectivity. It has to make, even bacteria have to make choices. You know, where's the food? You know, that's a bit acid, I better move away from it. You know, so he kind of argues in a minimal way. You know, he talks about it in a very kind of basic way. Ideas like subjectivity, ideas about freedom, okay, ideas about self-consciousness, ideas about agency is intrinsic to the world of nature. It's intrinsic, it's inherent in nature. And so he's very, very much against the social biologist, okay? Because the social biologist, the classical Darwinian things, that the environment, that creatures, life forms are static, okay, and they're imposed upon by the environment. And he denies that actually organisms, even bacteria, are actually agents. And he talks about this as participatory, that organisms participate in their own evolution. They're not just passive things with the. And also, what he also doesn't like about the social biologists is they're all into genes and genetic. You know, and what Bookchin saying, the real important, and he's following Darwin actually, the real important unit in evolution is the organism, the human being. Now, he gives this paradox, but what he argues, and he's kind of unique in this way, that he emphasized very strongly both sides of the paradox. Okay, both sides. On the one hand, he's very strong on the fact that humans are a part of nature. On the other hand, he's equally strong on the idea then actually these humans are quite unique things. They are quite unique. You can see what's happening in the world. You know, they're quite unique in that way. And he holds on these two things. Very, very important. I don't think I'm going to finish everything because what's the time?
No, you will.
I'll go a bit on the dialectics. If you don't mind, I'll leave all the anarchism out, which you probably know a lot about. And I'll just
Talk longer. It's okay.
Okay. I'll just a little bit about what is linked with this. One, because he's stressing both, and what a concept he uses quite a lot of for everything really is an ethics of complementarity. So when he's talking about human beings and community, he's talking about complementing both. You can't have that humans are social beings. You can't have one without the other. You know, and if you put all the emphasis on individuals and whatnot, forget community, you're completely one-sided. If you put all the emphasis on community or the social life, you're equally one-sided. What you have, somebody said this in the seminar yesterday, that you ask a question and you ask a child, what do you think is good for yourself and for the community? And it's that sort of stress on both. That human beings are social beings, and it's a dialectic interaction. He never talks about culture and nature like anthropologists tend to do. Anthropologists fall, you know, Levi-Strauss, it's all to do with culture and nature. Everything's natural. I mean, all this is to Bookchin, that's natural, you know. That chair is just as natural as a bird's nest. Just different. Birds' nests are produced by birds, and this is produced by humans and other organisms, you know. And what he, instead of using that culture nature, he talks about first nature, and he talks about human beings producing a second nature. You know, they produce cultural landscapes, they produce technology, they produce social life, they produce culture, and he refers to that as second nature. But what he doesn't do with his ethics of complementarity, he does not see these as a dualism. There's not a dualism between first and second nature, because second nature comes out of first nature. There's a continuity between the two. And what he tries to suggest in bringing them together, you've got to link the mutuality of it. Things. And this is an important thing with his evolutionary theory. He follows Kropotkin a lot in stressing that in the natural world, in natural evolution, in organic evolution, okay, or organisms like that, it's a kind of that Bookchin talked about mutual aid. Mutual aid. In other words, although there's competition, although there's control, okay, although there's conflict in the natural world, actually, what is really important about natural evolution actually is the cooperation, the mutual aid, okay, and the symbiotic relationship. I mean, if we got diverse organisms, you know, you've got a plant, you know, and you've got a fungi, and they get together and produce lichen, you know, which is a symbiotic organism. So he talks about the importance of mutuality in that. I'm a bit worried because you want a bit of talk again. Let me just quickly go, and I'll just, you know, squash it all together. I talk about his dialectics, I talk about his ethics, and leave it at that. He was a dialectical thinker, like Aristotle, you know. And what he considered when he was developing his social ecology, coming from a Marxist background, because he's been steeped in Marx and Hegel, who were both dialectical thinkers, he thinks it's important to bring together dialectics and naturalism. Okay? Naturalism is a way of understanding the world, it's an ontology of metaphysics, and he wants to bring into it dialectics, which is a relational kind of way of looking, and he wants to bring the two together. And he appears to have steeped himself in dialectics. It kind of, I got the impression from what something Dimitri said. He seems to have gone to bed with Aristotle's metaphysics, you know, with Hegel's, you know, system of logic, and with Engels' dialectics of nature. You know, what he wanted to do was to absorb what actually meant by dialectics. Now, some deep ecologists and all these sort of primitivists and whatnot, they dismissed Bookchin and said, Bookchin, you know. You know, this dialectics is, they talk about it's sort of mystical gibberish, you know, mumbo jumbo. Dialectic is not mumbo jumbo. Basically, what the three things that are important about a kind of dialectical way of thinking. One is, going back to Heraclitus, who was the famous one, you know, even before Aristotle, who was also a Greek, okay, was the idea that everything's changing, nothing's static. Things come into being, they endure for a while. I was born in 1936, I'll endure, I'll drop dead. You know, that's the way of the world. Everything's changing, nothing's static. Nothing's static, everything's changing. Ideas are changing. And that was nice when Dimitri was talking about how concepts, you know, like human rights, is not a static thing. It's a concept that's evolving, as it were, and changing its meaning. You know, everything's changing. Ideas are changing, organisms are changing, the world's changing, you know, the cosmos is changing all the time. The second aspect of dialectics is you can't study anything purely in isolation. You can't study anything in isolation. Everything is linked with everything else. Old Bakunin was saying this. You know, everything is linked with everything else, and you can't sort of treat anything in isolation. Everything is interlinked. And the third way is to stress the importance and get your head around, but don't lose of it, what you might call contradictions, or what you might call tensions, or what you might call unity of oppositions, okay, or what you might be called paradoxes, because that's the way the world is. The world is full of these kind of paradoxes that come together. So there's that in time. And I love quoting from Engels. There's a little quote from Engels, okay, where he's criticizing Kant, basically, and the positivists. Of course, Bookchin is very anti-Kant. In fact, he says Immanuel Kant's caused more problems than, you know, most philosophers, really, you know, because his nature disappears with Kant. You know? It's an unknowable. So this is Engels, and Engels is arguing against the positivists, and he's arguing against people like Kant and whatnot. And this is what he says. And he's criticizing these people who are not dialectical. They're not dialectical. He says, in the contemplation of individual things, it forgets the connections between them. In the contemplation of their existence, it forgets the beginning of end of existence. Of the repose, okay, it forgets the motion. And so that's what he basically says. The giveaway is his use of the word motion. Okay? Now, what's important about Bookchin's dialectics? He agrees with Aristotle, he agrees with Hegel, he agrees with Engels, the importance of dialectics. But he's critical of both. Aristotle and Hegel, they have a very mystical religious view of the world. Theological, okay, and he's against that. They also have an idea that the dialectic comes to an end. You know, that it says that there's a teleology, what the word in that philosophy is called teleology. There's an end product, you know, to the end. And for Bookchin, there is no end. You know, he uses a word to describe nature as fecund and creative. There is no end. Nature is always continuing, you know, whether it's human nature, whether it's human culture, or whether it's the world itself. It's always changing, and it's a fecund, creative process. There is no end in that thing. And he's also against Engels, of course, because he thinks Engels is still stuck in the kind of mechanistic, materialist way. And he says, Engels, like that quote indicates, Engels thinks of change as motion. You know, Engels, he says, he's still into the idea of matter in motion. Okay, of course, what Bookchin is about is development. So the things that Bookchin stresses, in his dialectics, one is that seeing causality as not mechanistic, but emerging, the things that are emerging. And he uses it. It would actually be, nowadays in philosophy, it would be described as an emergent materialist. But as I said, he didn't like the word materialism. But he's an emergent, so without things. The second thing is, to see the world, it's not consisting just to change of motion, it's to do with process and development. The world is a process, the world is a development. And that development, he speaks about his phase called grading. You know, it's not just a line. It's actually, it goes in phases and grade and all like that. So he's got that. But when you look at individuals and when you look at relationships, it's no good just fixing yourself on things and forgetting the relationships. In fact, he doesn't like the word relationships. He talks about interactions. And it's no good looking at relationships and forgetting the things. Again, there's a kind of dialectic between the two. And that's what he meant by dialectic. Have I got a time?
You're okay.
It's 22.
Listen to me. What you are saying, and I think the hall here is in complete agreement with me for once, that what you're saying is very interesting, very important, and you have our collective agreement to go on to your final climax. Take your time.
Right.
Right?
I won't go to my final climax, and I'll leave out the anarchism and all that. But I'll just talk a bit about ethics, actually. Bookchin is a very ethical thinker. He talks about ethical socialism. He's a very ethics is thing. And what he thinks we need to do, we not only got to develop a philosophy, okay, we've not only got to develop a different kind of society, we've actually got to develop a different, an ethical way of looking at the world. And he talks about an ethical sensibility. We've got to develop an ethical sensibility in our relation to the world, okay? And is what is called an empirical, an ethical naturalist, okay? In other words, he's like Aristotle, he's like Spinoza, he's like Kropotkin. Our ethic, and he actually talks about nature as being the ground for ethics. That's one of his favorite phrases. You know, nature is the ground for ethics. In other words, in simple terms, what he's saying is, what we decide how we're going to live and how we're going to live the good life and how we're going to relate to each other has got to be based on our knowledge about the world, our knowledge about nature and about our knowledge about people's relationship with nature. Okay, it's got to be done. And so it doesn't think that you can base ethics, you can't base ethics on custom and tradition, you know, sort of cultural relativism. You can't base ethics on our whims, you know. I think it's good because I think so. You can't base it on emotions like the logical positivist. You know, what is the basic of ethics? Oh, I just feel like it, you know. And you can't base ethics on kind of transcendental absolutist things. You can't base ethics on these are the holy books. This is what it says in the scriptures. Or this is what some shaman, or this is what some kind of, you know, religious guru says, you know. You can't base ethics on all of that stuff. You can only base ethics on your understanding of the world. And we realize this, it can actually be misused like everything else. But that's his basic idea. It's a kind of empirical naturalism. Now, he's often been ridiculed by Peter Marshall and a lot of scholars. And there's a famous thing in philosophy saying, you know, it's a naturalistic fallacy, you know? So it's called the naturalistic fallacy, that you can't base norms or moral values on facts about the world. You can't do that. If you do that, it's called the naturalist fallacy. You know, you can't do it. The thing is, the naturalist fallacy is itself a fallacy. Because although there's no logical connection between values and facts, there's certainly an empirical connection. You know, I used to, around by my house, when my little girls were little, I always used to give them the imperative, hold my hand. Okay? Because there was a lot of traffic zooming along the road. There is no logical connection that the fact there's a lot of traffic running along the road and me telling my little girls to hold my hand. No logical connection, but there's certainly an empirical connection. The reason I ask these kids to hold my hand, as it were, is because there's a lot of traffic going along the road and they might get run over, you know? So we have to base our ethics on how we understand the world. Two other things that's important. He often talked about in this present crisis, we've got to develop an ecological sensibility. And he talks about it as being stewardship. talk about stewardship. We've got to develop a sense of stewardship. He also talks about, you've got first nature and second nature, which in the present sort of situation are often seen as into opposition. What we really need to do is develop a third nature, and he often refers to it as free nature. Okay? That's what we've got to do. Of course, everybody, deep ecologists, liberal scholars, primitivists, they all say, oh, Bookchin's terrible. Bookchin's terrible. He wants to control the world. He thinks that humans sort of dominate nature. You know, he's a technocrat. You know, he's a utilitarian, all that. What they do is completely misunderstand what Bookchin's actually trying to say. When he talks about stewardship, if you read him, he says what we've got to develop is we've got to learn to develop a respect for the world, a respect for other life forms, and a respect for nature. He doesn't like the word reverence, because he thinks reverence has a very religious connotation. He talks about respect. We've got to respect nature. We've got to respect other organisms. Okay? We've got to develop a love for organisms and the importance of empathy and all that. Okay? And when he talks about first nature, second nature, free nature, when you read him, what does he mean by free nature? What he means by free nature is developing an ecological society. Developing an ecological society which respects and enhances both you, and this is the ethical of complementarity, it respects both humans and other life forms in the natural world. They're not in opposition. You have to try and do both. He doesn't see one is in contrary to the other, you know. So that's what I think. I won't go into the thing, but I will say, basically, in terms of his anarchism, he was an anarchist all his life, basically. But what he conceived, basically, was he conceived of an ethical society based on anarchist principles that combined libertarian and the emphasis on the individual and human freedom. It was socialist. Okay, so it was concerned with mutuality and commonality and shared understanding of the world. It was ecological, that societies have to be intrinsically in kind of harmony or mutuality with the natural world. And it was democratic. Okay, it had to find ways in which ordinary human beings in communities could resolve their difficulties and could organize their social life. Okay, and for there were two things I think important about him. One, he was one of the real people that was a founder in a way, or one of the inspirations of the ecology movement, despite what this Radko says. You know, we're along with Mumford and a few others, you know, Barry Common on things and Rachel Carson. Bookchin was one of the really important persons who actually got us thinking about the world in an ecological sense and expressed an ecological sensibility. The other thing is, in terms of anarchism, he really was he's the most important writer that led to a revival of anarchism and Peter Marshall emphasizes this. The Bookchin revived anarchism in the 1970s. You know, that's why I'm a fan of. So I'll stop there. Sorry, I've gone 10 minutes over.
I'm inviting Federico to animate the discussion. I want to say one thing, a personal opinion and conviction that I have about Bookchin, because it always comes up, and it came up again last night at that wonderful dinner that we had in the Pizarro Taverna facing the Mediterranean. I was asked, you knew Bookchin? Yes, I did. Wasn't he a difficult person? Standard. Well, Bookchin, in my view, was a genius. And many geniuses are difficult. You know, Beethoven was a genius. He was a terrible person. Much more terrible than Murray Bookchin. So keep that in mind. Some people have enormous things to say, enormous talents, and some of them are difficult, and some of them are not.
So thank you to Brian for the very interesting presentation. So we have exactly 8 minutes on our half-an-hour delay. So I will take 2 questions and then I will assess again the time. Okay? And please be very concise and precise on your question. So here.
Yes, about this Bookchin ethics, that it's in a way objective ethics based on knowledge, and it's quite a lot of business for that. But it isn't so that just to function, that just be a rational ethic, you need a different kind of knowledge production. Knowledge production must be also democratic, and you need democratic structures. Otherwise, any objective ethical system, it's up to be elitistic or authoritarian.
Okay. One more question.
Can we take more than one?
Then let's take 2 and then see what time we have. Yeah.
I would like some more clarification perhaps, or about how do we take the ethics from nature? Because one might say that perhaps even Locke said, okay, we have some ethics from nature that say that this is the natural state we're living, so let's take this ethics and put it in our society. Some others say perhaps nature is not non-ethical, it's aethical, doesn't have an ethics. So what kind of ethics we take from nature? What is the ethics of nature that we should take? And isn't the ethics exactly the thing that makes up this second nature of humans? Nature doesn't have an ethics. Ethos is exactly what distinguishes us from animals, perhaps. Not languages, not our logical things. There's a very nice quote from a British author, I think, that says, is it progress for a cannibalist to eat with a spoon? So it's not our artifacts that make us human, it's our ethos. So it's something very distinctive from nature. I would like to ask, what is the nature of ethics that we should take and put it, apply in our society?
Yeah.
That interlinks the 2 questions, actually. You must be clear that Bookchin's very, very clear. You cannot read ethics from nature. You can't read it off. You can't read it off because nature itself, first nature, is not ethical. It is not ethical. Something eats something in the wild everywhere, so humans can eat something. No, he says, applying ethical things on the natural world is just a misconceived thing. It's cruel or good or bad or whatever. The natural world itself actually is not ethical. So he's making the distinction. But what he's trying to avoid is going to the other extreme, okay? And setting up a kind of dualism between this is ethics and this is nature. He's trying to say they're interrelated, and what links the natural world and our ethics, okay, is our philosophy and our knowledge of the world. Okay, so it's always mediated, and that brings up what you're saying about what knowledge would we do. And basically, he's a Democrat, you see. So from the knowledge, he feels there's things that to be discussed and that. But of course, for him, it always relates to nature. It's not. That's why he's against the postmodernist idea that the postmodernists tend to take humans out of nature. So anything we decide is just decided between humans. If it's somebody like Rorty, who's a very famous philosopher, what is true and what is that? Oh, it's just what people agree to, Bookchin's stressing the importance of democracy and sharing things and agreeing things to, but for goodness sake, don't lose sight that there is a world out there, which we have to respond to. If you think of him all the time, he's a dialectical thinker, okay? And he's trying not to reduce one to the other. So he doesn't want to reduce ethics to nature, Okay. On the other hand, he doesn't want to completely separate it. And someone's like, well, ethics. That's why I hope it wasn't a silly idea of me and my little daughters holding hands, But that's an example where I use my knowledge, because I know these cars knock people down and kill people. I asked my daughters, which is an ethical thing, Keta, hold my hand, I mean, that's a simple illustration that you can do. It is complex. There's no simple. And, for goodness sake, Bookchin always recognise it, And in that book on urbanisation, there's a phrase somewhere where he talks about, I don't want to provide recipes for the world. For goodness sake, realise that every human being is unique. Every human being is different and unique. Okay, every society, every community is actually different and unique. And the ecosystem, the eco community in which the society is situated is also unique and has its own integrity. And you can't collapse what you. There's no. I don't think he's saying there's simple answers to anything. But what he's trying to say is that you look at things dialectically. Trying to see things in that way. Avoid the extremes. And he's against anybody that dualisms, which is why he's against Descartes and Plato. And he's against the idea of collapsing one into the other, whether it's ethics into nature, whether it's humans into society, or he's against anybody that sort of. And he talks about this reductionism, that we reduce one to the other, and he's against that. Positions, and he's against reducing one thing to another. Whatever way you want to set up, humans and nature, body and mind. Okay, I mean there is a distinction between body and mind. The problem is either reducing one to the other, or seeing them as oppositions. Recognize the mind body. They talk about, even in Malawi, they talk about the body and the mind. But they're not Cartesian. I don't know if that answers your question. But basically, he's arguing that nature itself is not ethical. He's trying to. Another favourite word of his is integrity. You have to respect the integrity of things. So you have to respect the integrity of nature, rather than foisting upon nature your own kind of thinkings about it, and talking about, well, lions are the king of the jungle, or leopards are cruel, or and then kind of drawing from that your own ethical things. He doesn't want you to do. He doesn't think people can do that. I don't know if that answers. I'm not really answering, because I think Bookchin would say, it's very difficult working out things. But what he does is try to work out what a kind of philosophy he's trying to work out, and now from the philosophy you get an ethics, and from the ethics you get a society, an ecological society. And he's trying very systematically. He doesn't work systematically against all these systems, thinker, and he's trying to link things together in a way. As Aristotle did, and as Spinoza did. Spinoza the same. His book's called Ethics. This is the way the world is. You don't have to agree with him, but he's got the same kind of way of. You start with the world, as it were, and people within the world, and then you work out the ethics and the social life that we want.
About knowledge production.
I'll tell you, because knowledge production, for him, I think anyway, the same thing as knowledge, what we do in sharing within a particular community. But he was anti-science. Anti-science. So the thing is that science is a group of people that share knowledge and collaborate with each other. And ideally, that's what science is supposed to do, and he would agree with that, Don't appeal to the gods and the spirits. You work it out between humans, collectively sharing knowledge and trying to work out what to do.
Good. So we'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll see.
We can go on 15 minutes.
Yes, I heard.
Not a question, maybe a bit of an elaboration on what Brian was saying in terms of Bookchin's view of an ethics that can be derived from our understanding. I have to recognize that Bookchin's project was really the reharmonization of first and second nature and the emergence of what he called third nature, which was freedom. And that project really informed his views in terms of the kinds of ethics that could be derived from nature. He certainly recognized that nature contains everything. You know, you can look at nature and you see competition, you see violence, you see death, life, whatever. But he did identify some key aspects, or he called it tendencies, within natural evolution, he thought would move us towards a reharmonization of humanity and nature if we could take those ethics and apply them in society. And there were some key points that he always emphasized. One was the idea of unity and diversity, the idea that in ecosystems, and I could go on, but briefly, that in ecosystems, the most fecund ecosystems are the most stable. He recognized stability as homeostasis, not that they were unchanging, but that they maintained a balance as they changed. He recognized that nature was non-hierarchical, that the lion was not a king of beasts, that there was no lowly ant, that there was not a food chain with the carnivores on top, but rather a food web in which there was interaction. He recognized mutualism or mutual aid as a key aspect of nature that could provide an ethical framework for us. He recognized that there is in nature a degree of spontaneity, that the evolutionary process itself is spontaneous. Let's see, what else? Unity and diversity. Yeah, he recognized, spacing out several other aspects of nature that he, from his observations, and that was the ethical framework that he established, really.
No, I agree with Dan. There was one of the words that you didn't come up with, and I was trying to think when I was chatting about some of these. There's actually concepts that crop up all the time in Bookchin. You're talking about stuff like that. There's words like, mutuality, fecundity, and these are key ideas for him and whatnot. Freedom, self-consciousness and things like that. And the other one is fecundity, which is actually, what people talk about diversity, Humans, there's diversity in nature, and he has the idea that a human society would also express that diversity. It wouldn't be a monolithic kind of, everybody thinks the same, And that was his argument with the anarchists who, like David, my mate, David, well, he's not my mate, but David Graeber was sort of saying, oh, we've got to have everything consensus, And Bookchin says, well, you can't always everything consensus. Sometimes you have to have a democratic vote and whatnot. But he also has the worry that if you have consensus, everybody will start thinking the same. So there is an element of dissent, which is important. The people do think for themselves. No, I just everything done said.
Yeah, Dimitri.
Our institute that has brought us together here in Thessaloniki is not simply a gathering of intellectuals talking about philosophy or theory, as important as all of that is. It is also a gathering of activists. Now, to me, out of all of this philosophy, what is very interesting, very pivotal, Bookchin's politics. Bookchin's politics. And I would like to draw Brian into that area. Also have to see how all of this applies to the transformation of our society. And that's what I would like to draw out of Brian. The framework. So how we can see where we are and how we get out of where we are. The roadmap. The politics of social ecology. That's what I will tell you about.
Is there any other burning question? I cannot go home without asking. Okay. So slightly less than 10 minutes if you want to build this.
Yeah. You got a crisis, okay? To get to the crisis, you develop the philosophy of ethics. Bookchin was an extremely political thinker. You know, he was concerned about, you know, he was an activist all his life, and, you know, he created that. Interesting that in 2002, when he was the same age as me, he suddenly renounced that he was no longer an anarchist. No longer an anarchist. It's not true. He remained an anarchist all his life. He remained an anarchist all his life. What he meant by anarchist then, when he was talking about I'm not an anarchist, was that there was particularly in the States, there was a whole group of people who referred to themselves as post-anarchy, and there were people like there were the Sternerite egoists, McQueen and the people in the Anarchy magazine, you know, who were basically antisocial. They talked about the society itself was the enemy. Society, not only the state was the enemy, society was the enemy. You know, and you know, you should be doing. I mean, morals. We don't want morals. I mean, you know, I want to be free to, you know, telling me I mustn't sort of strangle the cat. I mean, why shouldn't I if I want to? You know, so he was against that kind of individual that came from the egoism. He was against there was another group, these were very dominant in the States when he was writing in the 1990s, that critique. Another group that were called, basically they were kind of anarchist primitivists, okay? They're not only anti-science, they were anti the whole idea of civilization and the whole idea of technology, you know? Of course, Bookchin, I'm not sounding too theoretical, but Bookchin was against, because he said, for goodness sake, you know, Bookchin wasn't pro all sorts of technology, you know. He didn't like industrial agriculture, he didn't like big factories, he didn't like big dams, he didn't like nuclear power, he wasn't pro all ecology. He said, it's no good rejecting all of it. What we've got to do is think about technology and how we're going to use it in a democratic society. What we're going to do, what technology can we have, what technology is anti-ecology and we get rid of it, and what we can use. And he often used the word bringing it down to human scale, bringing it down to human scale. Nor was he anti-civilization. He said that, I mean, John Burton, he actually says the human language is very symbolic. You know, we use abstractions. I mean, the way I'm talking now is, you know, if you're not English, you can't understand what I'm saying. You know, it's symbolic. And it's important about the human species to develop this symbolic language. You know, very important in human life, language and all that. And somebody like Zerden says, oh, that's it. You know, we don't want language. Not only we don't want agriculture, you know, I mean, language restricts we can't relate to nature very well if we start using language. You know, so we don't language. And Bookchin, of course, says that for goodness sake, you know. We can't be against civilization as well. What we've got to do, and there's this book that's a really good book. Most people think it's very Hegelian and it's very, very dense. It's more or less one of his most important books, which is the Ecology of Freedom. Okay. The ecology of freedom is stressing two things. And he's interested in the rise of hierarchy, which is what you talked about last night and the meaning of it, you know. And he's talking about the rise of hierarchy, the rise of systems of domination in their varied forms. And of course, he doesn't deny the importance of class. He doesn't important. In fact, he thinks there's two things in human history that have been important. One was the rise of hierarchy, because when he got very interested in anthropology, was looking at sort of hunter-gatherers and tribal societies, and he kind of argues they're not hierarchical. They have lots of things about them that are worthy of looking at and, you know, learning from. But he's interested in the rise of hierarchy and domination. And he talks about that, the legacy of domination. But this is most of human history. So he's not pro-civilization in the sense, you know, the rise of the state and the rise of capitalism, you know. But he talks about, like Kropotkin, he talks about there's two aspects of civilization. There's the legacy of domination and there's also the legacy of freedom. And that's what he's interested in drawing on historically. Of all the things throughout human history where people, particular times of revolution, that they're trying to sort of you know, develop their own forms of democracy, they've developed their own assemblies and all that, and they organise their own social life, independent of the state and systems of our nation. So, you know, like Kropotkin, he has a very nuanced approach to civilization. It's not good or bad. There's certain things are good and there's certain things, you know, bad. And so he's pro civilization. But then, in his last years, he talks about the radical movements, as it were. One is anarchism, which is what he referred to as lifestyle anarchism, which are all the Nietzscheans, the egoists, and the primitivists, which he says, I'm not an anarchist. That's what he means by that. And then he's very much against the Marxists, and he's very much against the anarcho-syndicalists, because he thinks that's still what he talks about proletarian socialism. That's still stuck in the 19th century, basically. And he's trying to sort of say in the 20s, things have fundamentally changed. And what we've got to kind of do is develop another form of politics, okay, which is based on the community, you know. He doesn't deny the importance of class. You know, he always said, for goodness sake, you know, I'm not against class analysis, I'm not against the class struggle, as it were, but what he's trying to say, what we need to do is develop a form of politics that focus on the community, okay, and focus on democracy. And it's true, what Dimitri was talking about last night, of reading something for Bakunin. Yeah, actually, within the anarchist tradition, both with Proudhon and with Bakunin, and we've got this idea of actually having a politics based on the local community and establishing forms of democratic control within communities. It's not that Bookchin's inventing all that. What he's he's a very historical thinker. So if you want to understand something, you've got to know how it came into being. If you want to understand something, you've not only got to put it into its context, okay? You've got to see where it's come from, how it came into being, okay? And he's trying to argue that there's a kind of tradition, actually of putting the focus, not only reflected in certain places in history, you know, with the sort of medieval towns, you know, challenging the spread of the state. You know, in the French Revolution, there was the sections in Paris were organising themselves and that sort of thing. In the Russian Revolution, there were the Soviets organising themselves. He's not, and he basically argues, of course, the other great thing for him is the assembly in Greece, the polis, you know, is a key thing. And he's not actually saying that we actually have to emulate that. He's saying what you actually draw on, you draw on that historically. You know, he's not saying, and he actually explicitly says, this is why everybody who criticises him about, you know, the Greek democracy, he said, look, for this, I know what it's like, you know. He understands the context of that. What is interesting is the idea of a democratic way of doing things, you know, in local assemblies and organising people, ordinary people organising them like. And a lot of anarchists sort of say, well, all he's doing is setting up a city-state. That's, you know, and he's quite explicit, you know. He doesn't consider majority voting meaning majority rule. You know? And I'll tell you the thing, my own feeling is, I'm wrong. There's three things he thinks are kind of somebody will use the word oxymoron. Was it? Oxymoron, you know, contradiction in terms. Three contradictions in terms for old Bookchin. One is this idea of a society of egoists. He says, if the people are egoists, there's no society. What we have to develop, and he talks about a rounded personality. And that's why he puts so much emphasis on the importance of education. You can only have a society when people actually have a rounded personality, and they're not egoists. The other thing he's against is the argument there's a market socialism. Market socialism, to Bookchin, is a contradiction in terms. His idea of socialism actually is a communitarian, you know, where people hold things in common. And also, I think, the idea of a democratic state is, to old Bookchin, is a contradiction in terms. If you have a state, it's not democratic. It's an oligarchy, you know. Democracy, when you have citizens that are equals and engaged in discussions and sharing and creating a community itself. And that's where the practical sides, this is where and I don't, some people have argued, and I'll give you a quote, which there's a lovely quote I have just the last bit. Some people say, it's the same with a lot of scholars, I got a friend called Ian McKay, I keep in touch with, he's a great Kropotkin, he loves Kropotkin, and we don't know that lot. And he actually, when he wrote an obituary of Bookchin, he said, oh, bloody hell, Bookchin. It's really sad, Bookchin. At the end of his life, he spent a lot of time trashing his own legacy. As if somehow or other, in his later life, Bookchin had renounced everything he stood for. And it's absolutely not true at all. And the idea that in his early life, he was just an ecologist, in his later life, he was interested in libertarian municipalism, it's not. All these things are in his own life. If you look at his three early books, post-anarchism book, ecological society book, ecology of free. If you look at those books, all his basic practical ideas are in those books. And there's this lovely quote on it. Find my glasses. Where are my glasses?
This one,
No, they're the one here. It's the trouble when you get old. You need glasses, but you need glasses to find out where your glasses are. Right. This is what Bookchin wrote way back at the end of the 1970s. Okay. What we must do in relation to the modern crisis is decentralize, restore bioregional forms of production and food cultivation, diversify our technologies, scale them to human dimensions, and establish, this is it, this is what he's writing way back in the 1980s, and establish face-to-face forms of democracy. So there's not two Bookchins in terms of, his personality, really, and there's not two Bookchins. There's not the early, John Clarke has got this idea that there's the early radical Bookchin, and there's all the Bookchin sort of, it's not. He's radical all his life, and he sees creating what he calls face-to-face democracies, as it were, okay, as being an essential part of what his kind of practical anarchist vision is. In other words, the focus is on community. Yeah. And I'll just say one last word. I've always been very fond of a chap called Rudolf Rocker, and Rudolf Rocker is one of the arch anarcho-syndicalists, actually. And yeah, at the end of his life, even Rocker was talking about really anarchists got to get away from putting all the focus, on insurrections and things like that, but actually put more focus on community politics and things. I don't know if that answer sort of helps you. So, yeah. There is the two Bookchins in the sense. There's Bookchin as an activist, and there's Bookchin who is a radical scholar, and an autodidact.
Okay, so I really would like to thank you, Brian, for the very inspiring presentation. And he will be around the next days. And if you have any questions, please message to speak to him. And so, thank you again.
Thank you. And now we have a Skype presentation 11:30, and that's 10 minutes from now. So we have a 10 minutes break, and then we set up the Skype presentation. That's next session.
Yes, great.